Welcome to the Lost podcast. You know, if you've just discovered us, well, you're lost no more. Wink, wink. We're jumping into our New York Times bestseller roulette series today.
Yeah.
And, we have a really interesting one.
Oh, yeah.
The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt.
Okay.
Have you heard of it?
I have, yeah. It's been making the rounds.
It's been making the rounds. It's tackling a topic that I think everyone's kind of talking about these days, which is why are young people struggling so much with mental health? And Haidt digs into all these different causes. But the one that I think is maybe the most interesting and maybe makes some people a little uncomfortable is the role of technology. So we're talking smartphones, social media, video games, all of that. Speaking of which, where is that coffee you promised?
Oh, so sorry I'm late. That Starbucks line was absolutely insane.
Oh,
but
that's-
I think it was worth it. Iced latte for you, as always.
Perfect.
And I went with the pumpkin spice because fall.
You know me so well. Okay, so let's get into this whole anxious generation thing. Is it just like people complaining, or is there actual data to back this up?
No, there's a ton of data. Haidt brings up all these different statistics about the rates of depression, anxiety, even self-harm and suicide among teenagers and young adults.
Wow.
And they've basically skyrocketed between like 2010 and 2020. And this isn't just, an American thing either. Researchers around the world are seeing the same pattern.
So it seems like there's something going on. But is it really fair to blame it all on technology? I mean, teenagers have always kind of been dramatic. I mean, Shakespeare was writing tragedies about teenagers way before smartphones.
Yeah, but the thing that is interesting is the timing. So you see this really sharp increase in mental health issues,
Right.
and it lines up almost perfectly with the rise of smartphones and social media.
Yeah.
So it's not to say that technology is the only cause, but Haidt makes a very compelling argument that it's playing a significant role.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So how does he actually connect the dots?
One of the big things he talks about is how all this technology use might be replacing real-world experiences, particularly for younger kids.
Okay.
So there's less time spent, outdoors, less face-to-face interactions, less unstructured time to just kind of be bored.
Yeah.
And all of that stuff is really important for kids to develop in a healthy way.
Right, like, learning social skills, learning how to deal with setbacks, all
Yeah.
that. But I can already hear parents saying, but wait a minute, my kid is like super social online. They have tons of friends on Discord. How does Haidt address that?
It's a good point. And he does say that, yeah, online platforms can have some social benefits. But he also argues that the quality of those interactions is often different.
Okay.
So online, you can carefully craft your image. You can filter your photos. You can avoid, awkward silences. And it's almost like you're living in this highlight reel.
Right.
And that can make it harder to deal with, like, the messier parts of real life.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it must be so hard for parents trying to figure all of this out, right? Because you want your kids to be happy and connected.
Yeah.
But then you see the potential downsides of all this technology.
Exactly. And Haidt actually captures that sense of powerlessness that a lot of parents are feeling. He tells some really powerful stories from parents who are just trying to do what's best for their kids.
Like what? Give me an example.
One that really stuck with me was about this mom. She was constantly fighting with her 14-year-old daughter about her Instagram use.
Uh-oh.
And any attempt to limit it, led to these huge meltdowns.
Oh, wow.
But then the daughter went to summer camp where phones were banned.
Okay.
And she was like a completely different person.
Wow.
Happy, engaged, totally back to her old self.
Interesting. What about boys? Is it the same story?
It's a little bit different. For boys, Haidt points to things like video games and sometimes pornography as playing a bigger role, particularly when it shifts from kind of casual use to spending hours and hours on it.
Right.
He tells this story about this 14-year-old boy. He had mild autism, and he's doing great in school, doing great in judo. But then during the COVID lockdowns, he became a really heavy gamer. And he just completely withdrew, became depressed, angry, and struggled a lot when his parents tried to take his electronics away.
So it sounds like it's not about one specific type of technology, but more about just the overall amount of time that kids are spending in these digital worlds and what they're missing out on in the real world because of it.
You got it. And I think what resonates with a lot of parents is that Haidt isn't just pointing fingers and saying technology's bad. He's trying to understand how complex all of this is and offer some guidance.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll get to that. But
Yeah.
first, I'm curious about the stories that he shares. Do they all follow the same pattern?
While they all kind of highlight this struggle that parents are having, trying to set these healthy boundaries, but also being terrified of being too strict and isolating their kids. And it's not always, so clear cut, like with that boy who became the heavy gamer. It's not like he had all these friends outside of his online world either.
Mm.
It's a really tough situation all around.
Yeah, and it speaks to those larger, like, societal pressures. Because it's not just that these technologies are designed to be addictive, it's also that they've become so embedded in our culture that it's like opting out feels almost impossible.
Exactly. And that's why Haidt doesn't just focus on these individual stories. He kind of zooms out and looks at the bigger picture, the cultural shifts that have made this problem so widespread.
Okay.
We can get into that a little bit later.
So there's more to it than just, like, individual kids and families.
Right. Haidt uses this term safetyism.
Okay.
It's this idea that we've become so obsessed with protecting kids from every little danger, physical and emotional, that we've actually made them less resilient and independent.
I see, I see. So how does that play into the whole technology piece?
Well, if kids are always on screens, they're not out there, in the real world, skinning their knees, getting into arguments, figuring out how to navigate social situations on their own.
Yeah, so instead of learning how to deal with those things, they become, like, more fragile.
Exactly, more anxious.
Yeah. He argues that we've created this culture where kids are shielded from discomfort, failure, even criticism.
So it's like we're setting them up to have a harder time when they inevitably face challenges in the real world.
That's one of the main points he's making.
Okay.
By overprotecting kids, we're actually preventing them from developing the coping skills that they need to thrive. And technology kind of exacerbates all of this with, these curated online spaces.
Right, right. It's like we're building a house of cards. It looks nice and pretty, but it can't handle any real pressure. So what's the solution?
Well, he's not saying that we need to completely ditch technology,
Okay.
but he does encourage parents to be more intentional about setting limits
Okay.
and making sure that kids have plenty of real-world experiences. So, like, actual limits, not just like, okay, you get an hour of screen time and then totally caving when the kid throws a tantrum.
He is definitely a fan of firm boundaries.
Okay.
And starting early,
Okay.
delaying smartphone ownership for as long as possible.
Which is probably easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much social pressure. All the other kids have phones. You don't want your kid to be the odd one out.
Absolutely. And that's why he also talks about the need for a more collective effort.
Yeah.
Like communities, schools, even governments, they all need to work together to create environments that really support healthy childhood development.
So it's not just about individual parents, like, fighting this losing battle.
Yeah.
There's a bigger role that society can play.
Exactly. He even compares the tech industry to the adults who were behind the children's crusade, back in the Middle Ages.
Children's Crusade.
Yeah, sending all those kids off on this misguided and ultimately disastrous mission.
Wow. Okay, that's a pretty powerful image. So he's calling for, like, a wake-up call.
Yeah.
Like, we need to rethink how we're approaching childhood in this digital world.
That's exactly right. It's
Okay.
not just a parenting manual. It's this call to action for
Yeah.
all of us to figure out how to create a world where kids can thrive, both online and offline.
I like that. It's not about demonizing technology, but about finding that healthy balance, right? And empowering young people to use it in a way that's actually good for them.
Absolutely. And speaking of empowerment, he also talks about the importance of giving kids more autonomy and responsibility. So letting them take risks, make mistakes, learn from those experiences, and actually that helps them build resilience.
So this is not just about, restricting technology. It's about also fostering independence.
Yeah.
And giving them the tools to actually deal with whatever challenges come their way.
You got it.
Okay.
It's not about creating this bubble-wrapped world. It's about preparing them for the real world.
That's a good point.
And I think that's what makes this book so important. It's not just fear-mongering about technology. It's this really nuanced look at the challenges that young people are facing today and a call to action for all of us to step up.
Yeah, I agree. This feels like a must-read for parents, educators,
Right.
really anyone who cares about, the well-being of young people.
Mm-hmm.
Can you remind us, what is the title of the book and who is the author?
Sure. It's called The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is, yeah. And it's by Jonathan Haidt. He's a social psychologist who's done a lot of work on morality and culture.
Okay,
And it's available in hardcover, paperback, and as an audiobook.
perfect.
You can find links to purchase it from various places, including Amazon, in the episode description.
Awesome. We definitely recommend checking it out.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, what's like one key takeaway you think our listeners should walk away with from all of this?
I think the biggest thing is we need to move past this whole debate of technology is good versus technology is evil.
Yeah.
It's just not that simple.
Hmm.
It's really about finding that healthy balance and creating a culture that supports the well-rounded development of young people.
Well said. That's a great note to end on.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this conversation about the anxious generation, I'm left thinking, like, where do we go from here? Haidt lays out all this stuff, but he also, offers a little glimmer of hope. So I'm curious, what are your final thoughts? What should our listeners kind of take away from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that this isn't just a problem for parents to solve. It's bigger than that. It's a societal issue. It requires a collective effort. And that means, we have to create a culture that actually supports the healthy development of kids in this, digital age that we live in. And
Right.
that involves everyone.
I completely agree, and I think it starts with that awareness piece that you were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
really understanding, what are the forces at play here? How is technology impacting childhood development? But then we have to actually take action.
Exactly. And action, can look like a lot of different things, right? Haidt talks about, policy changes. He talks about community initiatives, but he also talks about individual choices that we can make as parents, as educators, as
Yeah.
community members. And those can be things like, setting boundaries, really promoting healthy activities
Yeah.
and just having open conversations with young people about technology and its impact.
I love that.
Hmm.
It's not about, like, demonizing technology or sheltering kids from the digital world completely, right? It's more about striking that balance
Yeah.
and helping them figure out how to navigate this world in a way that's actually good for them.
Absolutely. It's about, fostering resilience, fostering critical thinking,
Mm.
and that sense of agency. Like, we need to give young people the tools that they need to thrive in both, the online world and the offline world.
Well said. This has been such a fascinating conversation, Brent. I know I've learned a ton, and I hope our listeners have too.
Yeah, me too. It's a topic that really deserves a lot more attention and discussion.
And on that note, we want to hear from you, our listeners. What are your thoughts on all of this? What steps are you taking to navigate, this world of technology and raising kids in the digital age? Head over to our social media pages. Let's continue the conversation, share your experiences, share your ideas, because really we're all in this together. And if you're interested in learning more, we highly recommend checking out The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. You'll find all the details about the book, including links to purchase it, in our episode description. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the anxious generation. We'll be back next week with another fascinating book from the New York Times bestseller list. Until then, be well and keep those conversations going.